So I guess you have to click on the option.
Yes, recording.
Okay.
Right.
All right. I think we are now live and it's already 10:30 a.m. Let's get straight into it. A very good morning and warm welcome to yet another Ideas webinar. The topic of our webinar today is China plus one, Convergence or Divergence in ASEAN integration. I would also like to inform that we will release a briefing paper on a similar topic right after this webinar. So please head to IDEA's website at www.ideas.org.my to download the paper. We would also like to thank Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, FNF, for their support in our mission to promote ASEAN integration. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed a systemic risk within the complex web of global value chains. The closure of factories in one part of the world has resulted in disruptions in trade of intermediate parts and also logistics network on another. As a result, many multinational corporations, MNCs, are taking a more decisive stance on reducing reliance on the Chinese supply chain ecosystem. Some MNCs have already relocated to ASEAN or make ASEAN a backup to their production in China, a strategy that is known as China plus one. Some ASEAN member state is likely to benefit more than others from these relocations. The question therefore is, will we see individual ASEAN member state pursue policy that is divergent, that may make sense to domestic needs, but somehow on a macro scale, hampering regional integration? Will this reverse success achieved in regional integration in the past? What does this mean to the future of ASEAN economic integration? Before I go any further, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lau, and I'm the Research Manager for the Economics and Business Unit here at IDEAS. Joining me in the discussion today are Dr. Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at IDEAS and also ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Dr. Ha, Economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, better known as ERIA. Dr. Upala, Assistant Professor at the School of Social Sciences, Waseda University, Japan. Welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We are also joined by viewers from Zoom and also on IDEA's Facebook page. So welcome and thank you for joining us. You may interact with us by posting questions or comments in the chat box, and the speakers can opt for either a written or a verbal response. And I'll try my best to also highlight your questions in the Q&A session later. I will start with a presentation based on the briefing paper, which we will release after this webinar, and this will take about 15 minutes. Then each speaker will be given 10 minutes to share their views on the topic. They are also encouraged to provide comments on the presentation. Following that, we will head to the Q&A session, and we'll try to end the webinar by 12 p.m. So let's get started. Okay, I hope you can all see the slides there. Let's get started here. So thinking about options for recovery following the disruptions or the economic shock brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and also lockdown measures implemented by most countries. Where can we find new impetus for growth? In the past, I think developing countries can respond to economic crisis by perhaps depend on advanced economies, trade, where they absorb our production or FDI. But that twin options are not quite readily available today. Can export and FDI continue to be a source of recovery for ASEAN today? According to UN data, or rather according to UN estimation, up to 45% decrease in global FDI flows to developing Asia is estimated. That is a huge number. There's a huge magnitude. I think UN is also saying that according to its data, just last year, for every $100 that is invested as FDI, Asia will get a third of that. So that's quite a huge magnitude here. Given the scarcity in FDI, do we expect to see more intense competition within ASEAN? How will individual member states react to this? In a world where global production of goods and services is organized in a value chain manner, is fragmented, and where countries specialize in different parts of a value chain, it seems to us that to be able to compete more competitively, you have to be more productive comparing to your neighboring countries, perhaps. But one bright spot that seems to be available to us, that seems to be shaking up the status quo here, is the relocations of MNCs away from China and increasingly to ASEAN. Perhaps it's interesting to start from here and ask the question, why do these MNCs leave and where do they go? Admittedly, some MNCs will choose to stay because perhaps they continue to see value in servicing the huge Chinese domestic market. Maybe some are in services, in products that are not easily tradable, or rather not requiring relocation in locations. But I believe there are some MNCs who are looking at having new manufacturing hub or as a backup, just in case the systemic risk arises in future again, where disruption in one part of China creates huge ripple effects across the value chain. Perhaps MNCs who are leaving because of this, they will be looking at countries that are more integrated, perhaps within the region. But I'm sure some MNCs will leave because of rising manufacturing costs in China. This is already a trend that is appearing before COVID. And perhaps these MNCs will then look for a cheaper destination in ASEAN and not necessarily ASEAN member states who are more integrated, who has a more sophisticated supply chain ecosystem. Yes, there will be some relocations to avoid tariff, to avoid being embroiled in this ongoing tussle between US and China. And also, let's not forget that Chinese MNCs are also expanding abroad. Where will they go? Perhaps will also depend on why do they go, why do they leave. So will this mean more convergent trends or divergent trends in terms of integration? Let's look at the total global value chain participation for the past 10 years, or close to 15 years now. I have data from OECD that shows up to 2015. So global value chain is a sum of the intermediate goods that you import from foreign countries and also your domestic value add in your exports. We'll come to the concept in a bit, but this graph is to show that over time, we are seeing, generally speaking, a falling trend, at least within Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, but an increase in GVC participation in Vietnam. But if you compare it with regional value chain, how much of that trade happens between ASEAN member states? Here, again, we see generally falling trend. But this time around, you see that Malaysia in light blue exhibiting a rising trend, means that Malaysia is getting its parts more, increasingly so, from ASEAN member states, and also exporting its goods to ASEAN. But we also see a drastic fall in Vietnam. Does this mean that Vietnam is less integrated in ASEAN? Is this the right way to interpret that? How much value is added domestically to your exports? I'll show you two of these slides now. And these charts are taken from the briefing paper, which we'll release later on. According to OECD, they categorized manufacturing exports by low, mid, and high R&D intensity. I'm showing you here for the sectors categorized as high R&D intensity, how much of the exports by each member state and its domestic value add. So in this case, the higher share of domestic value add is the equivalent to lower foreign value add, means that in your exports, you have less dependence on foreign imports. So we are comparing what happened in 2005 and 2015 in the space of 10 years, what has changed. ASEAN as a whole in green has seen more and more domestic production in high R&D sectors. You also have some countries with relatively higher share to begin with. This could perhaps point to the fact that they are probably less integrated to begin with in its total exports. So that's why they are starting from a huge domestic value add base. The same, I think, can be said about Indonesia as well. But generally, you see countries increasing its value of domestic value add. They can do more and more high R&D stuff themselves. The increasing bit is Vietnam, which has seen a decrease, which means that Vietnam could be importing more and more high R&D intensity related goods from foreign countries, which could also mean that they are trying to absorb new technology, more advanced technology, and in years to come, they might be able to increase their domestic value add. Let's look at the picture for low R&D intensity. I think it shows similar trend. ASEAN as a whole, we are able to add value domestically. Interesting trend is seen in Vietnam, again, falling domestic value add, which means they are importing more outside of Vietnam and Indonesia, and same goes to Brunei as well, where they started with a relatively higher share of domestic value add. I guess what we're trying to say here is that we are not too sure if too low or too high is necessarily ideal, because if you produce most of the stuff yourself, most likely you are not able to integrate and trade within your ASEAN partners. So for MNCs who are thinking of relocating away from China to ASEAN, they'll be looking at these countries and say, okay, if I have to get my parts, if I have to get my second tier supplies, you can imagine getting support from different tiers of suppliers, how sophisticated or how mature that ecosystem is. Will they be looking at countries where they are more integrated so that they know that they can get their parts quite easily and not having to worry about ASEAN tariff? I will just use an example from Vietnam, since I've touched a bit on Vietnam here, who depends perhaps a little bit more on trade outside of ASEAN. And I'm using the Vietnamese automotive example here. Vietnam is one of the fastest growing vehicle market, but very low ownership rate. So this is the growth in Vietnam's passenger vehicle market size. So more people swapping for 2 wheels to increasingly 4 wheels. Vietnam's passenger vehicles density per 1,000 people. In 1,000 people, somehow Malaysia registered quite a high density. Quite a lot of people own a car in Malaysia, Thailand. Surprisingly, for Indonesia and Vietnam, the number is a lot lesser. But in terms of how much of the production, the intermediate parts that goes into the car, we see that Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, they can produce most of the stuff themselves. And for the stuff that they can't produce, they will probably rely on the regional supply chain to fill the gap. But for Vietnam, the localization rate is still pretty low, which means that 70% of what goes into Vietnamese cars came outside of Vietnam. And some of them could come from countries outside of ASEAN, which might put them in a tricky position, because according to the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, it stipulates that zero tariff on vehicles imported from ASEAN when localization rate is 40%. So if the parts that goes into your car, more than 40% of it comes from ASEAN sources, then when you export it to another ASEAN member, you will have 0% tariff basically. So if this is not applicable to Vietnam, is it still cost competitive for Vietnam to set up, for MNCs to relocate to Vietnam and set up a manufacturing facility there? And we all understand that automotive industry is where you can nurture a more sophisticated supply chain ecosystem, where you have a spillovers, you have second tier and third tier suppliers helping you to build that car. Indonesia, I've touched a bit on Indonesia, so I should also highlight in the, and we also highlighted this in the report, is high domestic value add reflects increased barrier to attract FDI. So according to OECD FDI, Regulatory Restrictiveness Index, the higher the number is, the less open you are, the more restrictive you are. So Indonesia is quite restrictive compared to Malaysia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. And according to OECD, these are the 5 countries that we have data on for now. So as the president of Indonesia, is a statement that he made not too long ago that Indonesia is struggling to attract FDI, and they are looking at how they can increase that. So what does this mean to ASEAN integration as source for recovery? Is it right for us to think of ASEAN as a whole, ASEAN manufacturing hub, and not a single country manufacturing hub? Will MNCs look at the 600 million strong region and say, okay, that is the hub that can perhaps replace China one day? If we can do that, perhaps we are a lot more appealing to MNCs rather than competing individually. According to our ideas report that we published last year, only 15% of the trade liberalization measures are fully implemented, which means that a lot needs to be worked on liberalizing our trade. Should we also arrive at a consensus to establish minimum FDI standards so that we avoid getting into a race to the bottom competition? So this applies to the governance, this applies to labor rights, this applies to capital, so that we do not want to just because we want to recover, we need all those FDI, we compromise on the aspects of governance and quality and environmental standards. Strengthening ASEAN's hands in extra ASEAN negotiation. How is this relevant for us to increase our position when we talk about CPTPP and RCEP? Perhaps reviving the whole EU-ASEAN FTA rather than having individual members pursuing bilateral trade with EU. And there's also concerns on how do we address capital as part of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, so that we do not undermine the quality of our governance. So that's pretty much what I want to share, and I would like now to invite Dr. Jayant to present, and you're free to also comment on the presentation. Dr. Jayant?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lau, for that very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And before I start, let me thank Ideas for having me in this seminar here today, a webinar. And I would like to actually share my presentation, and let me see if I can get this going. Sorry, just give me a second. I think you can see my presentation now. Right. Oh, maybe not.
Dr. Jayant, we can see your presentation, but would you like to click on the full screen function?
Oh, yes. Okay, great.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry about that. Yeah. Oh, it's trying to do the full screen, I think. Anyway, while it's trying to do the full screen, let me just get going. Right. Okay. So, in fact, this is not the presentation I wanted to share. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, I think this is probably. Yeah, perhaps I can get your assistance in sharing the presentation if you don't mind. Yeah, this is.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I think our colleague is trying to share screen.
Yes. Well, oh, do I need to stop share? I've already stopped sharing,
Yeah,
right?
just stop share. Just give us a second, Dr. Jayant.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, right. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Yes. Okay. I think you move on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So what I would like to do in this presentation is speak about a few things and to build on what Lau has just presented by saying a bit about what's happening with global value chains globally, drawing on the latest work in the World Development Report from the World Bank, and why it's important to place it in context, I guess. Then I want to move on, say a little bit about China Plus One, since this is the theme of this webinar, how the US-China trade war will feed into all of this, and then finally finish off by saying a little bit about whether this means convergence or divergence for ASEAN integration in the region. Next slide, please. Right. So I think the first point to note is that in a global context, GVCs account for almost 50% of global trade today. And so it is dominant not only in the ASEAN region, where it's even higher, but even globally. But I think quite importantly, it has a greater impact on inclusive growth, right? So a 1% increase on average in GVC participation can boost per capita incomes by more than 1%, which is about twice as much as non-GVC trade, right, or conventional trade. So the income raising ability of GVC trade is about double that of all other kinds of trade, right? So because of this, GVCs can be a powerful agent, not only in increasing income, but also in reducing poverty in the developing world, and especially Asia, where most of the world's poor still reside. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this picture, I think, shows you how the trends in ASEAN, which Lau presented, is also reflected globally, right? This is the GVC share in global trade. So the decline started quite a while before COVID, right? And has continued. These data here stop at 2015, but other preliminary numbers suggest the trend has continued and, of course, accelerated with COVID, right? And that's what COVID really is, right? It's an accelerator rather than an inducer. And I think we should always bear that in mind for most of these types of phenomena. It's human nature to attribute most of what we see to the most recent shock, right? And the most recent and dramatic shock is COVID. But not everything is caused by COVID. But COVID does affect a number of things, but mostly by accelerating existing trends. The slowing down of value chains is increased by COVID, but not caused by COVID. Next slide, please. Right. Now, for this region, I think the US-China trade war is arguably the main factor that's affecting global value chains. As I said, COVID will accelerate these trends, but a lot of it, as Lau mentioned, started a long time before, right? Even before the trade war, right? Actually, rising wages and also a tightening of environmental regulations as China joined the WTO, started off this process, right, of relocation. Next slide, please. So, there's a long history to this process, and it predates COVID. And of course, the China Plus One strategy is often attributed to Japan's investment approach. Again, useful to remind ourselves that global value chains in this region started with Japan, right? Started with the Plaza Accord. Actually, interestingly, when the US was trying to punish Japan, as it is trying to do the same to China today, for the growing bilateral trade imbalance with Japan, right? But in those days, it wasn't a trade war. It was a negotiated outcome called the Plaza Accord, which was a forced appreciation of the Japanese yen and also the euro, or actually in those days, the German mark, that caused this shift out of Japan towards this region, right? That started it off. But then the China Plus One policy of Japan, pretty much started, I think, with the floods in Thailand in 2011. That's when the term was coined. Of course, it may have started before and increased after. But I think the floods in Thailand highlighted the fragility of value chains, right? Maybe we have become too efficient and too precise in how we, sort of engineered the whole system, right? It was so efficient because it was so perfectly engineered, but it was also so vulnerable because of the same thing, right? Any kind of small shock would cause, a huge disruption. I think, can you still see my screen?
Just give me a sec. Let me work it out.
Okay, right. Yeah. So, while there was, we went too far in trying to increase efficiency, and so it became too vulnerable. So what we needed to do was rebalance things and try and, reduce over-reliance on just one or a few markets in the global value chain, right? So this sort of risk diversification process called China Plus One had investments moving to new countries, and also outside of Thailand to the new Mekong countries as well, right? So it's a kind of insurance policy, as Lau mentioned, but it's actually better than an insurance policy, right? Insurance only matters during crisis, but when you diversify in this way, let's say you have another plant in Cambodia, that plant can continue to produce even during non-crisis periods, but production can be ramped up should there be a break in the chain somewhere else, right? So it's insurance, but more than that, right? And this can guard against all kinds of shocks. We know that they can be caused by environmental factors like floods, economic factors like wage rises or other factor prices changing, policy like trade war, and also geopolitical factors more recently, right? With the tensions rising between China and the US, but also China and Japan, Japan and Korea, etc., right? As China becomes more aggressive in its pursuit of, its dominance in the South China Sea, right? So tensions are rising, and this can lead to all kinds of outcomes that threaten this sort of perfect coordinated system. We need to diversify risks, right? But China itself is pursuing a China Plus One policy, right? It's a net exporter of capital now, and it's a major investor in this region. And so China is diversifying out of its own market too when it comes to production. And it's looking to ASEAN. So it's not just Japan or the US, to access the US market because of this trade war. It needs to move its production out of China, right? As do other countries that want to avoid the punitive bilateral tariffs in China. In the US market, if products are considered to be coming from China. Next slide, please. Right. Now, let me say a little bit about the US-China trade war and how it affects these global value chains. I think with global value chains, even a very small tariff can have big effects, right? And this depends on the value-added share, right? And to understand this, remind ourselves that the tariff, say in the US market, is applied on 100% of the value of the landed product in the US market, right? But the cause of the tariff, right, the trigger is just the value-added share that is deemed to come from China, right? So this idea is like one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. In this case, the bad apple is China, right? The bad apple could also be the US if exporting to China, because China has retaliatory tariffs on US exports, right? So you have to remove the bad apple, but it's just one in the whole bunch, right? So if it's, removing the value-added share means you remove the tariff on 100% of the value. So the actual effective protection, right, provided to other countries that might receive the China investment or investment currently in China is magnified, right? So it's actually the inverse of the value-added share. Okay, so imagine if the value-added share is just 10%, right? The inverse is 1 on 10% or 1 on 0.1, which is 100%, right? Or 10. So the tariff needs to be increased by this fact multiplier to understand its true effective protection or its true protective effect and how much of an impact it can have on relocation. Next slide, please. So here you can, to illustrate I've estimated the value-added share of Chinese exports to the US market, right? So this, I want you just to concentrate on one number at the bottom, which is bolded, that 30.9, that's a 31%, right? So that's for total manufacturing, right? So for total, on average, manufactured exports from China to the US has a Chinese content of about 31%, right? So-called domestic value added. So if what China needs to do to avoid the tariff on 100% of its total exports is to remove 31% of the value added, right? So countries that are not as efficient as China will receive that investment, or activities will move to those countries, even if they're not as competitive as China, as long as costs do not rise by more than some factor, right? So look at that, let's say the tariff is 25%, then as long as the costs of moving those activities to, say, Malaysia doesn't rise by 81%, it makes sense to move those value chain activities from China to Malaysia, right? So it's not 25% as the tariff rate implies, it's actually 81%. Costs can rise by up to 81%, right? Next slide, please. So that's the buffer that's provided to countries that compete with China for investments, right? So the tariff rate is misleading because it underestimates the true impact on relocation, right? We need to multiply it by a factor that's related to the value added share, not 100% value, right? If 100% of the value of a product was produced in China, then the tariff would be 25%, right? But if 50% was made in China, the effective tariff becomes also 50%, right? Yeah. So the bottom line is that a small tariff can have a big impact on relocating activities out of China into competing countries, many of which are in ASEAN, and Malaysia is one of them. Next slide, please. Right. So let me quickly move on. I know I'm taking up quite a bit of time. So I think the point to make is that to remind ourselves that GVCs by their nature are forever adjusting and adapting, right, to changing conditions and shocks. And they are forever responding by restructuring to different shocks, right? This is the dynamism that defines GVCs, right? That's how they were born and that's how they grow, right? Now, not all aspects of GVCs shift around. There are some bits that are quite resilient. These are usually the capital and technology intensive segments. In fact, these are the bits that we want to attract, right? We want to try and bring into our countries, but they're the ones that are harder to get countries to move. But labor-intensive activities are usually quite footloose, right? So this is where I think most of the restructuring would take place. Next slide, please. But that's where, at some point, even the capital and technology-intensive activities will shift if costs rise enough. And the tariffs, when they are magnified, could cause those kinds of shifts, right? Now, as Lau mentioned, I think, these ASEAN countries are competing with each other to get a lot of these investments that are relocating. But we should avoid a race to the bottom especially in terms of fiscal incentives, but also in with a lot of the things that Lau mentioned. You know, countries do compete in terms of environmental regulations and loosening them. Indonesia did it for a long time. Other countries also do it. Malaysia has also been accused of doing it. We should try and avoid that. It'll be great if you can come together and set a common set of standards. We've tried, it's not easy, but we should continue trying, right? ASEP, I think, will try again to do this, and I hope that you know, some common standards, at least some some basic bottom limits should be set, so that you know we don't you know, compete too much in a race to the bottom. Okay. While the relocations will not be equitable, again, Lau showed this very nicely, this is not a zero-sum game, right? So this may not necessarily lead to divergence, right? If, you know, one or a few countries benefit mostly, other countries that don't receive these investments will also be lifted through spillovers, right? This is how, you know, this has been this narrative of Factory ASEAN right from the start, right? You know, we have seen a few countries, Malaysia was one of the early ones, and Thailand, you know, benefiting, and Singapore, of course, from the first wave. And then we've seen Philippines and Indonesia also receive other more labor-intensive activities that, as wages have risen in those countries. And now we are seeing the new member countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and hopefully Myanmar soon, receiving them. So everyone benefits, even if they don't receive it in the first wave, right? So that increases integration and convergence to some extent, not divergence. And that's what I think will happen again, as it has happened before, right? So while countries compete for them and some win in the short run, everyone will gain in the long run. Next slide, please. Oh, right. Okay. So that's it. That's all that I have to say. Maybe just give me 1 minute and I summarize. I think, you know, these global value chains are forever adjusting, adapting. The trade war, I think, will accelerate those relocations. And there will be winners and losers, but you know, just like the trade war, where the world as a whole will lose, some countries are winners, some countries lose even more in the short run. In the long run, we all lose. But for value chains, some countries are winners in the short run, but everyone wins in the long run because there's these interdependencies and these tendencies for waves of relocations to take place. So with that, I'm sorry I've taken a bit more time than I should have now, but let me stop there, and I look forward to the other presentations and to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayant. Not to worry. I mean, I enjoy your slides so much. I hardly feel that the time is passing. I just want to quickly summarize some key points, which I thought is very, very interesting to share. I think I can appreciate how you share you provide the historical context to relocation. So you have given us the historical appreciation, the context that it's not a response to COVID, but you know, you have its origin way back in the 80s during the Plaza Accord, and Japan having been forced to relocate to ASEAN. And you also highlighted that the systemic risk, even when there were floods in Thailand, and you highlighted the fragility of GVC. But you also rightly point out, I think, or rather enhance the view that the China +1 strategy is not as just an issuance, but it can also be good in the sense that it diversifies the risk, so that the backup locations, wherever it may be, they can ramp up production just in case you know, one part of the value chain is disrupted. And very interesting when you share how even when in response to the tariff implications, MNCs could be relocating to places where they might not be as efficient or productive as a Chinese supply chain, if I understood you correctly. But there is still a net benefit of relocating, as long as the tariff doesn't, the cost of relocation does not exceed a certain calculation. That's a very interesting point, and I think you sort of predicted or shared a view that maybe labor intensive activities could see more relocations, but capital and technological intense activities could also come in case the cost rises further, or in case the tariff is magnified further. And lastly, you wrap it up by saying that we should not see this as a zero-sum game, and ASEAN as a whole can be lifted through spillovers from GBCs. Is that more or less covered?
Yes, no, I think that's a very good summary.
Yeah.
Excellent. But I might just clarify one thing.
Yeah.
I think you are absolutely right in that, and thank you for highlighting this, the point about how the relocations, because of the magnified tariff, magnified by the value-added share, being less than 100%, means that the benefits are higher than no relocation, right? But of course, the best, that's, as we are still in a second best world, the first best case would be the case before the trade war, right? Where there was no tariff at all. So in a world of, in a trade war world, relocations are better than no relocations. But the best case, of course, is if the trade war ends and there's no relocation, and we go back to, things are produced in China right now because they are the most efficient at producing. So we move to a less efficient second best case, less efficient producer to avoid the tariff, right? Which is better than not relocating with the tariff. But let's hope that we go back to a world of no tariffs, no trade war, so there's no punitive tariffs. But right. Thank you. Great summary.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, that is the ideal, that we move to the gold standard, right? And not, So yeah. I think, that's a very clear point.
An ideal that looks less and less likely, unfortunately, as we go forward now, because now this is a trade war caused apparently by the virus.
Right. Well, that's always hope and pray for the best. I would like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Ha. Dr. Ha, are you there? Okay, all right, Dr. Ha, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Before going to my presentation, I would like to thank IDEAS for your kind invitation to this very interesting web addresses, a very timely topic, which is of interest to ASEAN policymakers and have been on the discussion so far in the ASEAN official meetings. My presentation today will be based closely on the brief that you have shared earlier. So I would like to pinpoint some we could dig further. Okay, so let me start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Okay. Okay. Dr. Ha, would you like to perhaps expand it a little bit? Or if you think it's fine, that's okay as well. Okay, so it's a PDF file. Sorry. I thought it was.
Yeah, it's a PDF.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, okay. So I would like to follow up on Dr. Jayant's points on whether divergence or convergence is bad or worse, is bad or good, and how, in other words, how we should view the statistics that we have been seeing. My sense when reading the brief is that you seem to raise the concern of this so-called regional inequality in attracting FDI following the COVID-19, because obviously we see that among the firms who announce relocation, some countries be a more favorable destination, such as Vietnam. Then I would like to put forth the question that whether inequality, as you mentioned, in attracting FDI is a negative force for ASEAN integration. We see that this is not a new thing, as Dr. Jayant has already mentioned. The uneven capacity or uneven FDI flows to ASEAN has been ongoing for quite a long time, and the relocation has also started even before the US-China trade war, following the changes in regulatory environment in China, as well as the rising labor cost. So it's the inequality, if you say so, in the sense that some countries may attract more FDI than others, has always been there in ASEAN countries. If you look at the statistics that shows the FDI attraction to ASEAN countries for the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, then you see that obviously there's, we can observe that there's an uneven slices of the pie to different ASEAN countries. In terms of projects, we see that Singapore is the #1 destination in ASEAN countries in terms of FDI attraction. For all these 3 years in 2010, 15, and 20, the number of projects to Singapore account for the largest portion of the total projects invested in ASEAN. So these include both extra-ASEAN and intra-ASEAN FDI inflow. In terms of capital investment, we see a bit different structure, where in recent years, 2015 and 20 in particular, Indonesia seems to be the largest FDI attractor in terms of capital investment. However, the key message here is still, even though the pattern changes, the uneven piece of the slice of the pie has already been there, and it's always been there. So COVID-19 would not be the sole factor that creates this problem, but it may trickle and may result in further uneven distribution of FDI flows. Now, whether it's a worrisome issue is another problem, is another question. I would also like to provide support to Dr. Jayant's point that this is not a zero-sum game, because even though it's uneven, it's a win-win for all. Some countries may attract more, some countries may attract less, but all gain, both directly through the FDI inflow into the country and indirectly through the interaction with other countries in the region, through the value chains and through the services links as well. And open regionalism is something that ASEAN has always been pursuing. It is different from the EU model, where they are more intra-EU focused. And it is this open regionalism that helps ASEAN to balance the need for economic development at the same time of regional integration, given the very different gaps existing among ASEAN countries. So yes, some countries benefit more than others, as you have already mentioned, and we have heard a lot. Vietnam indeed is the biggest beneficiary of this relocation wave. This data recorded the FDI relocation from China. So it could be from China to other countries or among provinces in China, within China. That's why you see China here as well. The first observation was recorded in 2013, but indeed most of the projects relocation here were recorded in 2018 and 19. So exactly after the US-China trade war. with Vietnam being the leader, accounting for about 1/4 of the number of projects and about half of the capital investment out of China. And we also see Mexico is as an attractive destination for relocation, probably for US firms with close links in the North American region. And then we also see quite a lot of other ASEAN countries in the list. Malaysia, Thailand, each for about 6% of the number of projects, and for Thailand, about 10% of capital investment. So it's also a noticeable number. And if you look at the employment statistics, you see that relocation tends to fall into the labor-intensive industries and stages. Like Vietnam, we see the average jobs created by one project at about 1,500 jobs, compared to only 100 in the case of Singapore. So the relocation to ASEAN countries, ASEAN countries in general tend to be in the labor-intensive sectors, as you have already discussed. So what I would say here is the point is the uneven distribution is always been there. It has been triggered more by the US-China trade war and the COVID-19, but it doesn't mean that it's a new thing that is completely created by these incidents. And open regionalism is something that ASEAN has been pursuing for long, and although it could result in somehow slow progress of regional integration, it fits well with the characteristics of the ASEAN countries, where we have very different political system and also very noticeable, remarkable economic development gap. Now, the second point I would like to raise, taking from your paper, is whether we should view the regional integration and extra-ASEAN trade and FDI as a trade-off. So I noticed that you mentioned about Vietnam, but it seems that it is the general perception that the governments seems to pursue outside ASEAN integration, and it results in the very slow progress at the expense of regional economic integration, as your wording. Is that always the case? We see that Singapore, yes, to some extent, countries are very vigorous in participating outside of the region. FDA's agreement, like Singapore, they have 25 FDAs, and only 6 of them are with ASEAN. Vietnam has also signed 14 or 16, and also 6 within ASEAN. But I would not view it as a trade-off. So if you say it's at the expense of regional economic integration, then I think that's something we need to reconsider. And we often talk about the stable or not much, we do not see much improvement in the share of intra-ASEAN trade. So it stays at about 23 or 10 to 25%. And it is often cited as the result of the lack of progress in the regional integration. To some extent, this lack of this very slow progress could be one factor. We do address that apart from tariff, ASEAN has made quite slow progress in other areas such as non-tariff measures. However, there are different factors that affect the trade flows and FDI flows. It's not just the integration arrangement across country. On the supply side, we have the factor endowments, which affect the production cost and again affect the price. We have the technology capacity of the firms, which also affects the quality of the product. And in ASEAN, some countries have quite similar comparative advantage. We produce similar products, and without much differentiation in the value, in the quality of the product, then there is less room for improvement of intra-ASEAN trade. And on the demand side, the level of income and the affects also the preferences, the consumer tastes, then that also affects the trade flows. So if we look at the point here is the ASEAN's efforts in regional economic integration is one factor that affect the trade flows, but there are other factors that need to be taken into consideration. And if we look at the absolute values, indeed we still see growth in the intra-ASEAN trade. So yes, we need to further speed up the integration process, but at the same time, we should have a pragmatic approach to assess the progress. And on top of that, it's not just the government who decides who can determine the flow, but at the end of the day, it's the firms, especially the MNEs, who choose where to locate and consequently define the GVC pattern. Now, if we look at the factors that affect firms' choice, location choice, you have mentioned why firms relocate and where do they go. Then I would like to also provide you some supporting statistics to show this the factors that affecting firms' decision to do FDI. This is not just the factors affecting firms' relocation, but rather FDI location determinants in a broader sense. This graph shows the data for companies investing in ASEAN, China, India between 2010 and 2020. It's worth noting that this only covers a sub-sample of the firms, FDI firms, because not all firms indicate their motives or determinants. So it's collected for those firms who respond. Then we see that what is attractive to the firms here is the potential, market potential, including the domestic market growth, where about maybe 56 or 57 of FDI projects at firm side mention this as one important consideration for firm to invest in these countries. And then we have also related to market potential, we have the proximity to customers or markets. Then come the regulatory environment as one important factor. This highlights the government's efforts in improving the business environment and attracting FDIs. The availability of skilled labor, some factors related to infrastructure availability, including transport, infrastructure, and the formation and the thickness of industry clusters. Now, you also see the lower costs as one factor of consideration here, but it's compared to other factors, it accounts for quite a modest percentage of FDI projects in consideration. So with this, we may expect that in the future, ASEAN countries would be able to attract more FDI given their high potential domestic market growth. Now, my third point is domestic market versus export. Now, we encourage firms to export and to participate in GVC, and there have been evidences that participation in GVCs or internationalization activities in general contributes to productivity improvement, innovation as well. But my point is, given that improvement in productivity, should we think of it should we think that focusing on domestic market, on the other hand, is a bad thing to do? It is a bad policy option. Now, this is also extracted from your paper. You mentioned about Indonesia's inward policy. Now, it depends on how the government pursues the policy goals. If they if they apply protectionist measures in favor of domestic producers, as they are doing in some aspects now, then obviously it reduces social welfare and it should not be encouraged. However, in a broader sense, if the shift inward for supply chain production processes to service the domestic market is based on non-discriminative policy measures, then that should be fine. Indonesia obviously has a very large domestic market and they have the potential to grow. So it is justifiable that they would like to also take advantage of this large potential in addition to export. My last point is on the discussion about the non-tariff measures. You mentioned briefly that we observe an increase in the number of non-tariff barriers in ASEAN countries, but I would like to flag whether the increase in the number per se should be viewed as a lack of progress within ASEAN countries. Before coming to that, I would like to first make a small clarification in terms of terminology. We have non-tariff measures which refer to the whole set of policy measures that affect trade in quantity or prices, excluding tariffs. And among these non-tariff measures, a small subset is non-tariff barriers. And by WTO's commitment, non-tariff barriers are illegal and should be dropped. And because of that, if you look at the NTM's database of ASEAN, you will not see these NTPs like are very limited with a very clear roadmap for elimination. For example, quantitative export and import restriction, or the prohibition. Those things you will not, if the goal or the objective is not justified well, you will not see it in the database. So I think it would be better to refer to this group of measures as non-tariff measures, because even the legitimate non-tariff measures can create significant cost if they are not well designed and well implemented. Now, coming back to the question whether the increase in the number per se is an indication of the lack of integration and lack of commitment among ASEAN countries, then I would say that it is not necessarily the case if you only look at the increase in the number. Let me show you an example. As you may know, AREA has been cooperating with UNCTAD to construct the NTMs in ASEAN database. Recently, we have also extended the database to cover +6 countries. So for the data now, we have RCEP countries in place. And we have done 2 rounds of data collection for ASEAN in 2015 and 2018. And this statistic shows you that first, we observe that there's an increase in the number of NTMs in all countries. And the second observation you see here is Thailand seems to be, if we only rely on the NTM count, and then Thailand seems to be the most protective or restrictive. The number of NTMs in Thailand per se account for about 1/3 of the total number of NTMs in ASEAN. But is that the case? If you look at this prevalence of import NTMs by country, then you see that Thailand is in the bottom. The coverage ratio shows the trade value affected by at least 1 NTMs, and the frequency index shows the ratio of number of products affected traded products affected by NDMs. So if we trade 10 products and 9 products are affected by at least one NDMs, and we have a frequency index of 90%. And if we count the trade value ratio of these 9 products, we have the coverage ratio. So why is this the case? Because in Thailand, many NDMs are actually applied on only a very small subset at the HS 6-digit level. So for example, for shrimp, they may have one regulation on a specific type of shrimp, but not all types of shrimp. But in other countries, these NDMs may affect all types of shrimp. So it results in different coverage ratio and frequency index that is not reflected in the number of NDMs per se. So reading the NDM statistics requires, it's a bit tricky because unlike tariff, they are textual regulations. And the NDM count can only reflect the extensive margin of the NDM's application, but the intensive margin, how strict the NDM is, depends on the particular text that you have to dig out in order to have the answer. So it's a bit tricky. And so moving forward, I would think that we need a more pragmatic approach, taking into account this difficulty in quantifying the restrictiveness of NDMs, as well as taking into consideration the necessity of NDMs to protect the consumers, producers, the environment as well. And in your paper, you also mentioned give examples of some NDMs, which I think should not be in place at this moment, like quantitative restrictions. Obviously, for the COVID-19, some countries have set up temporary NDMs, but I believe that they will be removed sooner or later because obviously, in the normal condition, they are against WTO's rules, and it's very easy to detect those kind of NDMs. Unlike the seemingly legitimate NDMs, but they can be designed in a sophisticated way to protect the domestic industries without, but still very difficult to challenge, as the non-tariff barriers. So these are the few points that I would like to raise regarding the paper, and I think a few discussion points should be taken into account. So to summarize, just 2 key things. First is that we should have a pragmatic view on the divergence or convergence of ASEAN, because the low or the stable intra-ASEAN trade and the small intra-ASEAN FDI is not necessarily a bad thing. And different factors need to be taken into consideration. And the second thing is that we should not view it as a win-lose game, but rather in the longer run, because of the spillover across country. If one country receives more FDI, let's say, I would expect that other countries also benefit as the spillover impact from, due to the interconnectedness across country. And third, a few points of discussion should be probably of wording or discussion should be taken into account more carefully, in providing the policy recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ha. This is something I would really want to sit down and discuss with you further. Well, it looks like we are actually quite short of time. So I just want to also mention that some points are very thought-provoking. Other factors, other endowments needs to be considered. It's not just government policy, but also M&Es. You provided this chart on location determinant, which also show perhaps the potential for high domestic market growth in the region. I think they're trying to paint that picture, and also very thought-provoking comment on Indonesia, Whether or not it's bad to service the domestic market, it depends on the government tool. I think you rightly mentioned that unless it's about protectionism and which reduces welfare, then that may not be too encouraged. But if it's not discriminatory, so it's not necessarily just because of that you see it as something in a negative light. You have also given a very good context to understanding NTMs. It might not necessarily mean because of that you therefore conclude by saying there's lack of integration, because some of them could be temporary as a response to COVID. But I think you sum it up by saying that we need a more pragmatic approach to understand NTMs. So I thought that's pretty thought-provoking, Dr. Ha. I would like to now move to our last speaker of the day, Dr. Upala. Now, Dr. Upala, you shouldn't feel under pressure to wrap things up by 12. I think
Okay.
I think we can extend a bit of our time, and want to also discuss some of the questions that we received from the audience. The floor is yours, Dr. Upala.
Okay, thank you. So let me share my screen first. So can you see my slide?
Yep. See if you can do full screen as well.
So you don't see my slide?
I see your slide. Would you like to click on the full screen function at the bottom right corner? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Ideas to invite me to this interesting discussion on the China Plus One. And luckily, actually, Dr. Jayant and Dr. Ha nicely explained all the points that I would like to raise here. So please regard my presentation as a compliment to your policy brief paper and also the previous panelists discussion points. And because we don't really have time, so I would like to quickly move to the points of discussion that I raised in my slide here. So first of all, I would like to talk about the overall view that you explained in your policy brief paper. So basically, I think the paper is there was quite clear messages for the overall trend of GVCs in ASEAN and also raised several interesting points. But as Dr. Ha said, there are still some few points that need further examination because I think because one thing is that the policy brief has to be brief, so maybe you don't have more space to elaborate all these points of argument. And the last point is that I know the COVID-19 is quite recent, so maybe we still do not have data, but maybe in the future, I would love to see more analysis on the impact of the COVID-19 on this convergence or divergence in ASEAN integration. Okay, so my first point that I would like to raise here is, as Dr. Jayant and Dr. Ha just read before, in my view, I also think that COVID-19 is just act as an accelerator for this convergence or divergence in ASEAN integration, because China Plus One strategy has been used by many firms, especially Japanese firm before the COVID-19 crisis. And I give you some example here. For example, Ricoh says it shipped production of US bound products to Thailand from China, and Ricoh officials say output in Thailand has increased by about 10%, or Mitsubishi moved some manufacturing of semiconductors and machinery for US customers to Japan away from China. So this is part of the China Plus One strategy. But the other story is that there is also complete relocation strategy to a different country from China to ASEAN or back to Japan. For example, Daikin also turned to Thailand to replace China as the production base for compressors used in air conditioners, or Sharp is also planning to shift production of laptop computers, digital signage, and multifunctional copiers destined for the US market of China to avoid higher tariffs. So I think this would be like negatively affecting China itself, but on the other hand, this one would be benefiting ASEAN countries that receive the investment in our region. Okay. And the next one in your paper also talk about reasons of relocation, like including like low wages, geographic proximity between China and ASEAN, and also trade ties between China and ASEAN, single market and RCEP. I put question mark here because like this is just my personal view. I'm still skeptical about the role or the success of the RCEP, and I'm not sure whether it's going to be finalized this year or still be postponed to, I don't know, next year or other years. And one thing I would like to add on is that actually another reason that China or other countries kind of consider ASEAN as a destination of the new production base is because of our value chain ecosystem of ASEAN, because in ASEAN you can find a wide range of producers, like ranging from a country with advanced technology such as like Singapore or Malaysia to emerging economies specializing in labor-intensive production activities such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So like when investors come to invest in ASEAN, they can kind of build their own supply chains or regional supply chains in ASEAN easily, because we can, ASEAN can provide a wide range of services or productions in the area. And this one, I just would like to give you some example from of the ecosystem of electrical and electronics global value chain in ASEAN. And as you can see, there are many functions, many products, and many producer countries. And if we focus on the producer countries, we can see that all like ASEAN countries are occupy many or most of the positions along the value chain. But sadly, we are not in the beginning or the end of the value chain, which provide higher value added. But anyway, we still occupy a large share of the position of the global value chains here. So we can see that this is the ecosystem that we can offer to the investor to come invest in the ASEAN region. And the next point is about the unequally distribute benefit from the relocation. And I really agree with Dr. Jayant and Dr. Ha. Like actually this kind of situation has been going on like long before the COVID-19, and if we look at the position of each ASEAN member state, the message is quite clear that the benefits would be different. And this just because it depends largely on like what kind of industry that you look at and what kind of comparative advantage that each country offers, and also depends on the trade and investment policies and maybe some other few factors that you can think of. So I think at the end, the benefits would not be distributed equally. And this chart, I just want to give you some of the idea of the foreign value added by ASEAN and by Japan and ASEAN in China and US exports. So maybe we can just focus on China, which is the red bar chart here. So you can see that Japan and ASEAN offer different products and contribute to China's export in different industry, but we have something in common, which is the electrical and electronic equipment industry that Japan and ASEAN contribute a lot to China's export. So as you can see here, for ASEAN, maybe this chart can kind of imply that if there is the relocation of the Chinese companies or Japanese companies that invest in China or some other companies that invest in China, then maybe this industry will benefit the most out of this relocation of China to ASEAN, including this electrical machinery, mining, petroleum, and maybe some other services like trade and financial intermediation and business activity. Okay, and I would like to move quickly to the next point about the GBC and RVC participation, because your paper also discussed about this, and you can see this from the brief paper that the degree and trend of GBC and RVC participation varies greatly across ASEAN. But again, like it also depends on industry. Like actually, each industry they have their own characteristics. So maybe it would be better if we can kind of have further examination, like at the industry level rather than the country level alone. And actually, like different elements in global value chain and regional value chain provide different policy implications. And I would like to give you some example here. This is from the ASEAN GVC and RVC participation in electrical and electronic equipment industry during 1990 to 2017. And as you may know that GVC participation have two main elements, which is the foreign value added or the FVA, and another element is the domestic value added incorporated in other countries' exports. So basically, FVA is just the part that we rely on foreign inputs, but for the DVX is the part that other countries relies on our inputs or our exports from ASEAN. And my statistic also consistent with your statistic that the FVA of ASEAN or the DVA of ASEAN is increasing over time, or the FVA is declining over time from 1990 to 2017. But if we look at the foreign value added created outside ASEAN, actually we can see that it has been declining over time. In contrast, the foreign value added created within ASEAN has been increasing over time. So we can see this contradict trend within the FVA itself. But anyway, the overall trend is led largely by the foreign value added created outside ASEAN. So we see the drop in the foreign value added during 1990 to 2017. And there is good news for ASEAN is that the DVX or the inputs that we export and other countries use as an input to produce their own output or own export has been decreasing. It means that we can gain from these value added exports more during this 1990 to 2017. And at the end, we can see that the GVC participation has been declining, as Dr. Jayant has explained before. But actually, my statistic shows that the RVA participation for ASEAN has been increasing over time, but actually, like recently, has been a bit declining during this 2 years period. Okay. And the last, I think this is my last point that I would like to cover is that like Dr. Lau also mentioned about this, like whether low or high DVA would be good for ASEAN countries. And actually, I also have the same question, and I wrote papers about this GBC reports for ASEAN Japan Center. And actually, in those reports, I try to convince the audience that like the concept and the analysis of GBCs are very tricky, and higher GBC participation and higher DVA may not necessarily be good. And on the other hand, higher FVA may not necessarily be bad, because it depends mainly on the position on the value chain of a particular country, and also a stage of development of particular country. And also again, depends on the industry, like what kind of industry that we are looking at. So this statistic, I just would like to show like the overall DVA and FVA in the electrical and electronic equipment industry in ASEAN. Like in ASEAN, you can see that the DVA is lower than the FVA share. But when we look at the country by country, we can see that the level or the share is quite different, like or varies from country to country. When we look at Singapore, the DVA is quite low and FVA is quite high. But as everyone knows, like Singapore is the advanced economy, and they are one of the lead suppliers for the system, electronic system in the global market. But we still can see that the DVA of Singapore is low. So I don't know what to say about this, but like as I just said, like low DVA might not be bad for the economy, and it depends on the level of development or what kind of industry that we look at. And this is another example from Thailand. We can see that during 1990 to 2018, we can see a little drop of the FVA share and a little, increase in the foreign FVA in the FVA share, and we can see a little drop in the domestic value added share. But when we see the value itself, like by utilize more foreign inputs or foreign technologies, by increasing the FVA share, we can boost our export, value added content export quite a lot during these 2 or 3 decades. We can see that the domestic value added has jumped up like almost 10 times, and also foreign value added jumped up almost 10 times as well. And okay, sorry. And okay, maybe because we don't have time, let me jump up to the last slide that everyone was talking about the convergence and divergence in ASEAN integration. And I totally agree with Dr. Jayant and Dr. Hart that like even though the gains from relocation of MNCs would not be distributed equally among the ASEAN member states, the relocation will benefit ASEAN as a whole due to a close tie of regional value chain. And ASEAN can maximize these gains by improving domestic investment environment or strengthening a regional value chain, and closely following the AEC Blueprint 2025. So this is all that I would like to raise here. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Upala. I'm so sorry for putting you in this position where you have to rush through our slides. I mean, I'm so sorry for not keeping a closer tab on the time. But I think can we just do one question? Are you all okay to stick around for 5 more minutes or so? Okay, let me just try to consolidate a few questions, and also questions that we received from emails. I think we've spoken quite a lot about how, yes, different ASEAN member states could benefit differently from these relocations, but overall there should be a net expansion or net positive impact for all. But can I just ask maybe Dr. Jayant and Dr. Upala here, will we also see then unequal spillovers to domestic market, and what does it mean to smaller players like SMEs? How should we understand? Is there really a lot of industrial spillovers, industrial upgrading from all this FDI model? Do you think? What do you think is likely to happen? I think. If it's just cost competitiveness, labor intensive, sort of FDI, do we see in the long term industrial upgrading for SMEs and to increase overall welfare? Maybe Dr. Jayant, you would like to start on this topic?
Right. Thank you for that question, Lau. I guess the first point to make is to reiterate this idea. I mean, it's very similar to free trade or freeing up trade, right? Freer trade is hardly ever fair, but it's mutually beneficial, right? And that's what has been driving the liberalization in the world over, decades. In the same way, this kind of GBC relocation will not be fair in its distribution, but what's the saying? The high tide lifts all boats. Other countries will benefit, and I think, as Upala was saying, in the short run, we shouldn't expect major impacts, right? In upgrading, these things take time. If you look at, say, Cambodia or Laos, new entrants, and to some extent even Vietnam still, a new entrants, the initial benefit comes in the form of increased employment and wages, right? And usually low skill employment. But that's a function of and over time, as wages rise, we hope there'll be upgrading. It's not guaranteed. Malaysia is another good example of that, right? There's no guarantees that if you wait around long enough that you will automatically move up the value chain. And you cannot blame foreign workers for not moving up the value chain either, right? There's also a need for local skills to meet the requirements that foreign firms need in the form of scientific, engineering, and other skills for them to start moving up the value chain, producing higher value parts and components, and to have SMEs come into the picture in supplying those parts and components, and not just the labor used in assembly activities, right? There's a host of factors. There's a whole policy environment. It needs to be conducive. In Malaysia, the environment is good, but the dominance of GLCs in many sectors might limit, the entry of private firms. That is another factor that could come into the picture we don't often think about. In other countries, it could be all kinds of other red tape and regulations that stand in the way. So I think there's no guarantee, but if you get the policy environment right, over time, you will see an upgrading and higher value added activities taking place that provide higher returns. But just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it'll never happen. The ball's in the court of the policymakers, I think, to ensure that this happens. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Jayant. So, Dr. Ha, I think we lost you a bit just now. So we were just discussing, do we foresee industrial upgrading for SMEs, for example, from all these relocations? So maybe Dr. Upala, do you have any thoughts on how do we speed up the process maybe for this industrial upgrading process as well?
Okay, so actually I really agree with Dr. Jayant that without this opportunity, we cannot upgrade because we don't have capital to do so. We don't have if we don't have these opportunities, almost impossible to upgrade our industry. But as Dr. Jayant said, this opportunity does not guarantee that the upgrading of the procedure in the country, because it depends on many factors like policy, government policies, or the domestic investor like capacities to catch up with the technology that come to the region with the investment. So as Dr. Jayant said, like Malaysia is a good example, and actually Thailand is also another good example. Is that like Thailand is production base for automobiles industry, like for Japan, for like more than I think 30 years, and like we still most of the domestic firms like SMEs still in the tier like 2 or 3 in the industry. We never come up to tier 1 or even the top of the pyramid of the industry. So this is quite clear example that even though we have a chance or opportunity to join the global value chains, but if we lack of domestic capacities or the supporting government policies, is quite difficult for us to upgrade. But anyway, we have this opportunity, then we should grab it and try to work on it. Yes, this is just my opinion.
Well, I guess it's similar, quite similar experience here, I think, in Malaysia as well. Lastly, Dr. Ha, so perhaps the question here is, how do you see the industrial upgrading process be from these relocations, and where do you see the role of government really in trying to nurture an environment that allows for this upgrading to happen perhaps a little bit more quickly?
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with our previous speakers' responses. It doesn't happen naturally. In Vietnam, we have been able to attract a lot of FDI, not now, but since around 2006, 2007, with the introduction of the new enterprise law and the participation membership of WTO, among other FDAs. However, until now, we still see that the connection, the linkage between FDI firms and local firms is very weak. So FDI firms still have to seek input suppliers elsewhere out of the country rather than inside the country. The supporting industry is weak, and the SME's competitiveness in terms of technology and human resource is also really limited. And indeed, how to improve the competitiveness of the domestic sector is one of the priorities for the government for the development strategy in 2020 to 2030 in Vietnam. So for the government, I think the first thing is to continue the regulatory reform, reducing the unnecessary regulatory burden and improve the business environment for firms to operate, and also to invest in education to produce a quality human resource so that they have the appropriate set of skills to meet the new demand, and to nurture to enhance the linkages between the FDI firms and local firms through which spillovers can happen by building more efficient industrial clusters. So those are the few things that the government can consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we have taken a bit more time to complete the webinar, but I must say it has been a very, very fruitful discussion. There are a few more questions that we can't answer them, but I'm so sorry for our audience if we can't answer your questions directly. But you know, it's been a great webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Jayant, Upala, Dr. Ha. Hope to see you guys again. Take good care and have a great weekend ahead. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.